Hi, this is Tamara here, and what I wanted to ask you today is all about mentor. We have been talking about mentoring because we were celebrating 12 years of mentor with Alan Forrest Smith. That included different type of business mentoring, but specifically we were focusing on mentor copywriter. So what I wanted to kickstart my question is just basically if you could give us a review about 12 years of mentor, what's it's all about, why specifically it's slightly, your opinion about mentor copywriter, is that any different, is it part of the bigger business jigsaw puzzle?
Okay, well, mentor is always built on the back of when I very first started in business a long time ago. I never went into business just to make a load of cash. It was all about survival. So I had to pay for everything, I had to make the money. So for me, mentor has always been fast track. So in other words, how do you learn something very quickly without having to read everything, without having to research everything, without having to spend hours and hours and hours, because I'm not academic at any level. So for me, studying and reading and researching it's always a little bit of a challenge. So with mentor, I know that when I've been mentored myself in the past, when I was a hairdresser and other things, I always had this thing that I only have to learn what I need to know. So if there's 5,000 books on a subject, all I know is I have to find somebody brilliant and read that one book, not 5,000. And even with that one book, I only have to read what I need to know. Some things I wouldn't read. So when I first started to do, when I very first did mentoring, it was 1989. It was when I opened my very first business. I interviewed a young school kid called Kerry, red-headed, no colour in her skin whatsoever. She looked terrified. And when she very first came for the interview, which I'd advertised junior required for a hairdressing salon, I arranged to meet her in my new salon. And when her father brought her for the interview, the salon hadn't been built. So Kerry had to sit on a pile of bricks that had all been stacked, and I sat on some timber and did the interview. But what I didn't realise, and what I never even thought about, was the next, she worked for me for 8 years in total. But the next 5 years of that first period, because she left for a year, the next 5 years would be me mentoring Kerry to become a hairdresser as fast as humanly possible. And of course the nice thing with Kerry was she ended up having her own salon. I actually set her up in her own salon, and she moved to Australia in the end and created a new business. So, but 12 years of mentor for copywriters, it wasn't really built on the basis of, like these days, copywriters seem to learn copywriting and have this obsession that I'm now a copywriter, I have to create a course. Well, I'm not really interested in that, because I know that when I made a transition from hairdressing into consulting, stroke writing, doing copy and so on, I still had to pay my mortgage, I still had to feed my 4 kids, and I still had to pay for my life. So really, the original mentor, and more than ever today, the original mentor I did was really showing people how to develop these skills very quickly and make an effective transition from being an electrician into becoming a copywriter without reading acres and acres and shelves and libraries full of books.
Well, that's actually quite interesting, because I did want to ask you about shift and transition. Throughout those 12-year period, you've had a lot of mentoring students who basically what they were looking after was a transition from one particular job to becoming a, for example, copywriter, which is, and for example, somebody you just mentioned, one person could be an electrician and wants to become a copywriter. So there is a lot of, obviously the shift is taking place. So you've done that in the past successfully. So can you just talk about a little bit of that transition process? Because everybody is more or less in a similar situation where when you are making that transition, you still have to make sure you have your income coming in, and how do you successfully do that transition? Is that basically part of also what you're teaching?
Well, look, to become an electrician, you have to go through a system. And the system is a system of training which eventually leads you to being an electrician or a hairdresser or a builder. To become a copywriter, you have to go through a system. Now, it's interesting that some hairdressers, rather than becoming hairdressers in 4 years, can do it in 12 months. It's interesting that some electricians, instead of spending 4 or 5 years in a trade, can still do it in 12 months. That's the intriguing part of learning anything. How fast can you become really good at doing something you've never done before? I forgot what the question was. What was the question again?
How making that successful transition?
Yeah, so to make the successful transition, I can relate to it like in my own life, to make the transition from being a full-time hairdresser and salon owner into getting paid to write full-time. There's a few things I didn't have on my side then. One, I didn't have time. So with having 4 young kids, building my own house, 3 salons, and all the other things going on in life, I didn't have time to study. So to make the transition successful, I had to steal time. So the only way to steal time back was to do that when everyone else was in bed, because my days were completely filled. From the second I woke up to the second everyone was in bed, my days were filled. So I had to steal back time. So what I did with myself was, I did my study and practice when everybody went to bed. So it wasn't uncommon for myself to spend till 2, 3, 4 in the morning actually studying and learning this craft. And I probably did that for 12 months, easily 12 months. And that enabled me to make a faster and quicker transition, which was another thing to make the transition as well. I wasn't thinking about a system. I was thinking about, I had to make my wages very quickly to make a job change. So I couldn't spend ages learning tons of stuff. Which also meant that I always had a reluctance to read. I've never been a huge reader. So I didn't really want to get into reading anything. So what I did is I found one person I could idolise and worship for that learning period. That was David Ogilvy. I studied everything I could about David Ogilvy. That was it. I did read 1 or 2 other little bits, but it's not uncommon for me to buy a huge book and to read 2 pages. I'll only read the 2 pages I need to know, and maybe 5 years later I may read the rest of the book. I don't know. So the transition was the same thing I teach young copywriters now. One of the first things I teach them is, if you want to make that transition, stop reading.
That's interesting. That is interesting, because one thing I suppose that comes up a lot is that less reading, and would you say, what is it then? Is it less reading, more selective reading, or more like practical application, or what's the, because it is interesting that you like many people who are in the transition due to XYZ life commitments, nobody really has that free time that a college kid would have to just sit in the library and read. So less reading, more in doing practical work, or selective reading?
As you know, I was an ordained Bible minister for 20 years. One scripture in Ecclesiastes that I've never forgotten was, the scripture says, to the reading of many books there is no end. So in other words, to read things, we were taught this in Bible school. If we're going to read, it has to be of practical value. So if it's not of practical value, why do you read it? Now, for example, I had a new copywriter come to me very recently, and one of the very first questions I asked them is, where are they right now? Because you always have a starting point and a finish point, so I need to know, where are you right now? And one of those sub-questions to that question is, tell me what you've read. So this guy said to me, he said, well, I think that physical books I probably have about 300. I said, okay. He said, digital books I probably have around 2,000. I said, okay. I said, what copywriters are you reading? And he started going through all these copywriters, and in the end I had to stop him. I said, so you have 2,000 books, you have 50 copywriters you're following, you have 300 books on your shelf, and you've never written a piece of copy. And he said, no. Well, for me, that speaks volumes. The guy has wanted to become a copywriter for 5 years, and he's still reading. And the problem that a lot of copywriters have these days is, at one time when I started writing copy, especially online, you would go to Alta Vista, because Google didn't exist, type in copywriter, there was Alan Forrest Smith or Orange Beetle, there was Michael Fortin, and there was John Carlton, and there was Gary Halbert online. That was it. You couldn't find anything else. You type in copywriter into Google now, and it pulls up over 80 million finds for copywriter. And every new copywriter these days wants to make a course, because they think they'll make more money making a course. So you've got to go back right to the beginning on the transition, which is create focus and use your mind effectively. And for me, that begins with reading less. Because not only is there a lot of information out there now on copywriting, there's tons of misinformation. Tons and tons of misinformation.
What do you mean, misinformation?
Well, for example, it's not uncommon to work with copywriters. It's not uncommon to work with copywriters who are so systematic and formulaic that they've forgotten how to communicate through the copy. All they're thinking is, there has to be a pre-head, there has to be a headline, there has to be a subhead, there has to be this particular salutation at the beginning of the copy. The body copy has to start like this. This part here, I have to put a testimonial, then I have to put some bullet points, then I have to put some features. And they've completely forgotten about the communication element within copywriting. If you look at the history of copywriting, it goes back to real old Bible teachers. That is where the history of copywriting begins. How do I transfer this information effectively to a crowd that wants to be saved? Sorry, you were asking another question?
I'll ask you in a minute. Yeah.
How do I transfer this information effectively to people that need to be saved? So in other words, how do I share what I know and create a call to action at the end of it? Now, this is why I love people like David Ogilvy, John Caples, Barnum, who wrote his own. He was not a copywriter, he was a circus freak show host. These guys knew how to communicate super effectively without all the complications and restrictions that copywriters are taught these days. And of course, that's how I write my own copy. You know, I never think of myself as a copywriter. I think of myself as, how do I communicate this information most effectively to either move the individual who's reading it or to get them to do what I would like them to do.
That actually leads me to the point I wanted to ask. You mentioned about copywriting as a way to communicate, to, I suppose, ultimately deliver the certain message. And we live, I feel we are living at the moment in the interesting period of time where kind of mind of consumers also are shifting in a way that, for example, how consumers are buying is slightly perhaps changing due to the fact that maybe, you know, there is a level of consumers who want to know, for example, where the stuff is made, or you know, the choice, how they can make choice in that noise. You notice, you mentioned that there are, was it 18 million or whatever search results when you are searching online for, say, copywriters. whatever we're searching, we get so much choice that people are becoming more selective how they buy things, and that creates obviously a new set of challenges for the businesses and copywriters as well to deliver the certain message. So what do you think, I suppose, the future of copywriting is in this changing consumer awareness future society?
I think for someone like myself, I mean, I'm not saying I'm of higher intellect, because I'm not. I'm just interested in interesting things. So if something's interesting, I'm very interested. And I think, well, I know, for one, most copywriters these days are teaching copywriting that is completely irrelevant. The reason for that is because we live in a period, we always have been in periods, but more than ever, of mind manipulation. So the mind is always continually being trained by forces outside our control. It's been trained by smartphones, by iPads, by laptops, by the web, by these endless feeds going in. And because maybe at one time, let's just take a guess, at one time we had 5 feeds of information coming into our mind in a day. And if we lived in a village by the lake, the feed was, the lake, the fish, the trees and the wind and everything else. But these days we have literally tens of thousands of feeds that we don't even realise passing our minds every single day. The world of copywriting has shifted massively. It's shifted massively. And I don't believe right now there's probably even 1% of copywriters realise this. I just don't believe it. And what it is, they're missing what the consumer not wants, but needs. Now, we are in the age of information overload, mind concentration deficit, and the brain is now trained or manipulated to concentrate less than ever. People no longer say, "How'd you do that, Dad?" People now say, "I'll Google it." People no longer say to their master, "How'd you do this?" People say, "I'll Google it." People no longer go through the craft of learning for 4 years. People say, "I'll watch somebody on YouTube." I mean, we were building one of our apartments in Tbilisi recently, and we asked the guy if he knew how to do it, and he said, "It's no problem, I'll check it on YouTube." So we're in a different period, a much different period than we've ever seen before. This period's never been here before, and it'll continue to expand for a while. The copywriters who can see that are the ones that will be, if you want to talk about money, I mean there's nothing wrong with talking about money, are the ones that will make the money. The ones who are just doing the same old stuff, yeah, it's got to be long sales copy, there's got to be formula, we've got to stack up the bonuses, don't forget the PS. These are the guys that are going to struggle in this brave new world of the information generation.
And I have the final question to ask about going back to the mentoring clients, to the mentees, or perhaps people watching this. We mentioned that obviously they're in a transitional period, and most of them have kind of full-time jobs. And we are kind of seeing another shift in the society where perhaps not irrelevant, but the idea of like full-time job, as it used to be during the period when the factories first started to emerge, and people had to go to the job, start at 9, finish at 5. That's kind of becoming outdated. So more and more people are looking for a better way of perhaps utilizing their talent or developing new craft and creating that custom lifestyle, if you want to call it. So is that the kind of the future, and is that the kind of the part of the mentoring, shall I call it training?